morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is you happen to be. Hope you guys are having a great day. And I hope you're enjoying this course. As always, it's really a goal of mine. If you aren't, you can let me know. If you are, you can let me know. But what I'm going to let you know today is about the Vietnam War. And I say that with a lot of like, woo, huzzah, right? But the Vietnam War is an interesting conflict. And it is one whose legacy we are still dealing with to this very day. In fact, the 1960s, 1970s was a real tumultuous period in United States history, politically speaking, militaristically speaking, for it is during this time that a lot of distrust begins to develop and form among the American population about the American political system. Not only do you have, false testimonies and false information being presented about the Vietnam War, specifically that we were winning the war. There's obviously a range of decisions made that in latter years demonstrated that the government was implementing policies that people may not have agreed with, such as the dropping of napalm and Agent Orange in Vietnam. The My Lai massacre, of course, also comes out during this time period. But you also have Watergate, which occurs during the Nixon administration. And all of these things sort of collectively reveal to Americans that the American system was not always being truthful and honest. And one of the big questions that historians and I think contemporaries, and of course I think we can still say contemporaries because many Vietnam vets are still alive, is why were we involved in this conflict to begin with? And I think the base reason for that is the United States had a commitment to containment. The Cold War really motivated the United States into moving into Vietnam. We did so in stages. In many ways, it was kind of a progression of a progress, whereby we started with just advisors, until eventually we send over 500,000 American troops into South Vietnam in order to defeat the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh. But one of the things I think we have to begin with when we talk about the history of Vietnam is that this was a conflict that, even though we don't completely grasp it today, I think people at the time didn't fully grasp it either. One of the truths about the Vietnam War is that the United States did not fight that conflict in a traditional way as if to win the war. If the United States had wanted to, they could have bombed Vietnam into obliteration, but they chose not to do that for obvious reasons. In doing so, you would have brought war upon yourself by the Chinese. You would have probably had North Korea, and definitely the Soviet Union would have likely enacted war against you. So you don't do that. So what you do is you remain in country as long as the enemy has a fight left in them. But the Vietnamese were not going to back down easily. I think we can see that very clearly when you look at the history of French colonialism that existed in the Vietnam region before the United States ever got involved. In fact, the loss of the French at Dien Bien Phu demonstrates the tenacity of the Vietnamese as they are lugging equipment and supplies up terrain that no one would humanly think was possible, and yet they did it against a power that had superior weaponry. I'm going to read to you from a book called America's Lost War, Vietnam, 1945 to 1975, part of the American History series, and in it the author writes the following. It says, "For their part, American officials, from presidents to cabinet members to military commanders, never really grasped that the United States faced an enemy of strength, one of fanaticism and staying power, one that had created an impressive revolutionary movement. In contrast, in South Vietnam, the United States had a weak foundation on which to build. No firmly established political institutions emerged in the Republic of Vietnam." And one of the things you need to be aware of is that at the start of the Vietnam War, Vietnam was broken up into two portions, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. There's a whole history here. We'll talk about the causes of the Vietnam War later. But in the northern portion, you had a communist regime under Ho Chi Minh, and in the south, you had a democracy of sorts, a republic of sorts, not really a republic, but you had an individual in power by the name of Diem. And Diem was really, really corrupt and almost acted as an autocrat in the region. In fact, his policies in South Vietnam really encouraged a lot of folks in that region to turn towards the Communist Party. And so in many ways, the United States was fighting an enemy not only from the North Vietnamese Communists, but in South Vietnam as well. And so we committed ourselves to remaining in Vietnam for as long as it took. Now, eventually, we leave the region in 1973. There's kind of a ceasefire, if you will, and we pulled out in 1973. And then within about a year and a half, 2 years, the city of Saigon will fall to the North Vietnamese Communists. And in the end, all of the efforts that the United States had were lost, because in the end, the country did fall to communism. And that was the big fear that many presidents had, right? When you look at the justifications for going into Vietnam, particularly under Andrew Johnson, I'm sorry, not Andrew Johnson, under Lyndon Baines Johnson, one of the things is that he's committed to not allowing the domino effect to happen. And the domino effect is that if Vietnam falls to communism, then all of Southeast Asia, all of Indochina is going to fall to communism. And so we were committed to staying in the region as long as it took. And that, of course, meant that you had to dedicate resources, you had to dedicate supplies, and because the war was deeply unpopular, eventually a draft will be erected in the United States, and folks will be forced to go fight in a war that they don't know why they're fighting, they don't know why they're there, and they don't want to be there. Interestingly enough, towards the end of the conflict, the number of folks hospitalized for drug overdoses increases. Folks begin to frag their officers. That is, they begin to injure their officers as a ways to get out of the country, even if they're dishonorably discharged or left or court-martialed, right? They just don't want to be there anymore. And one of the things that made fighting this war incredibly difficult was the anti-war movement that was obviously gaining a lot of traction back on the home front. When you take a look and you compare World War II to the Vietnam War, World War II had a lot of popular support, and it allowed for the United States to continue the fight as long as it was necessary. In Vietnam, that's just not the case. There's a lot of lack of support, and as Charles New argues, we just didn't fully understand what it was that we were dealing with here. My notes here state that, intensified by the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, some 3 million people, including 58,000 Americans, were killed during the Vietnam War, and more than half of the dead, that is about 2 million in all, were Vietnamese civilians. This is one of the things that makes the Vietnam War so catastrophic in the minds of Americans, is because oftentimes we think about the United States walking into these villages and just mowing people down. And that did happen. Again, you think of the My Lai massacre. Rape and sexual violence was a real thing. There are numerous accounts where rape and sexual violence just became SOP, standard operating procedure. There's one story that I've heard where a platoon of folks came into a village, and there was about 4 or 5 of these men who went in and gang raped a woman and then murdered her. And this was fairly common practice. Sex, rape, and violence as a weapon and technology of war was very common. And that's not to say that the United States is the only nation that does that, but it definitely happened in Vietnam. The My Lai massacre, where we just wipe people out. And part of the reason for that, and I don't think it justifies it, but it does help us to understand it, is that it wasn't clear who the enemy was. That was one of the problems that the United States had. I mean, one minute you might have a 15, 16-year-old over here playing soccer, and the next minute they're shooting at you. And so it's difficult to always pinpoint who the enemy is. The way in which the Vietnam War was fought was not traditional warfare in the way that the United States was accustomed to fighting. They were dropped in the middle of a jungle and forced to figure it out. The Vietnamese were very deceptive at times. They used a lot of booby traps. They would create holes and pits in the ground, and they would sharpen up bamboo pikes and stick them in the ground and then cover up the ground so that when you walked, you slip in, bamboo goes through your leg. The reality is, and I think the Vietnamese understood this, is that you didn't have to kill the Americans in order to put them out of commission, right? If I got a bamboo rod sticking through my leg, now I'm out. Plus, I got a couple other guys who got to carry me and carry my stuff. Well, that's 3 people you're able to take out. They're also very good at digging tunnels and having their headquarters underground. And so it was a difficult war, right? It's a difficult war. So how does it all start? That's a long question, but there's a couple things that you need to be aware of. The conflict in Vietnam really begins and is born out of French colonialism. The French had colonialized the region of Vietnam in the 19th century, and they engaged in building there. There's a lot of taxation that goes on there. By World War II, the Japanese take possession of Vietnam. And so what the United States does during World War II is, because Japan is our enemy, we support the Vietnamese in ousting Japan. One of the individuals who we support is a man by the name of Ho Chi Minh. It says, in response to the Japanese occupation of French Indochina, Ho Chi Minh forms the Viet Minh, or the League for the Independence of Vietnam. And the United States supports them during World War II, because Japan is our enemy. Following World War II, the French attempt to reassert their colonial control over the Vietnamese. And because we are now embroiled in a Cold War, we can no longer support Ho Chi Minh because he's a communist. We have to support the French colonists. And so we withdraw support from Ho Chi Minh, and in the end, the French are tossed out. And because there's this constant desire to not allow Ho Chi Minh to establish a communist foothold in the whole of Vietnam, the United States begins to support Diem in South Vietnam. And in the end, Diem does not do what it is that the United States hopes to be done. The United States will eventually support a coup d'etat wherein Diem is killed. And the situation just gets really unraveled. And eventually, by the time John F. Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, we have about 16,000 advisors in Vietnam trying to help the South Vietnamese military figure out how to fight. After Kennedy's death, Lyndon Baines Johnson comes into the presidency. Kennedy had always been instructed, or at least was largely instructed, to increase the military presence in Vietnam. But he was hesitant and reluctant to do so. Lyndon Baines Johnson seemed to not have that type of hesitancy. By the time the 1969 rolls around, we've gone from 16,000 advisors to over 500,000 men in South Vietnam. And the situation just begins to escalate. Now, the conflict, of course, is going to be a long and protracted conflict. It's going to be one wherein we fight on the ground. It's going to be one wherein we fight with airplanes. In fact, as it says, the very first real maneuver that the United States takes, or one of the very first, was nicknamed or codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. Rolling Thunder was a bombing. It was a strategic bombing of Vietnam. We dropped a whole range of bombs upon the Vietnamese throughout this entire conflict. That initial strategy occurred from March 1965 through October 1968. And one of the areas that the United States attempted to obliterate throughout the entire war was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a trail which allowed for supply lines and people to move goods from South to North Vietnam. The United States was never successful in destroying that. But as we move through the presidents, whether it's Kennedy, Johnson, then ultimately into Nixon, the strategies in Vietnam begin to change. In fact, when Richard Nixon becomes president, the strategy that he implements is the Nixon Doctrine. And the Nixon Doctrine basically stated that the South Vietnamese, by the latter part of the 1960s into the early 1970s, the South Vietnamese needed to start taking on the role of fighting this war themselves. And Nixon will implement a process known as Vietnamization, wherein he's going to pull back American troops, which of course he does, as I said, by 1973. But one of the things that Nixon's going to do in the process of pulling folks out of South Vietnam is to increase bombing into Cambodia. This is going to create tension in the United States, and it results in one of the most catastrophic protest movements at Kent State, wherein 4 students will eventually be shot and killed. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young ultimately write a song where they talk about this, where they say, there's 4 dead in Ohio. Watch out, Nixon's coming. And there's a lot of protest. And in fact, the music that comes out during this period is a lot of politics of protest. There's a lot of anti-Vietnam War music. And the Vietnam War mobilized lots of different people to become, antagonistic towards the United States. What are the consequences? It says in the United States, this is my notes, by the way, in the United States, the effects of the Vietnam War would linger long after the last troops returned home. It says the nation spent more than $120 billion on the conflict in Vietnam, which, it says here in my notes that it lasted from 65 to 73. The United States was involved in Vietnam for longer than that. But the main thrust of our involvement in Vietnam, really 64, 65, right? It says the most immediate effect of the Vietnam War was the staggering death toll. The war killed an estimated 2 million Vietnamese civilians, 58,000 U.S. troops. Okay, it says those wounded in combat numbered tens of thousands more. And of course, one of the long-lasting consequences of the Vietnam War physically for people was the amount of Agent Orange that was dropped upon folks. Agent Orange, napalm, these are herbicides that created long-term health concerns for Vietnamese soldiers. The other thing that was really troubling is that because there was such antagonism towards the war, that antagonism was then projected upon the Vietnam vets, and when they returned, they were ridiculed, they were spat upon, they were called baby killers. And it's deeply unfortunate because the Vietnam War created a lot of psychological stress for these soldiers, and when they came home, life wasn't made any easier for them. That's deeply problematic, I think. It also, of course, created some discontent among Americans with respects to their government, because the government was telling the United States that we were winning, and the newsreels that folks were watching in their living rooms every night said a different story. And so it became clear to a lot of folks that they were being lied to. So, the war itself is very broad. It's really something that I think we need to think deeply about and kind of figure out how we can move forward as a country in the wake of the Vietnam War. And so hopefully as you go through this week, you'll be able to think through some of that material. If you have someone in your family who was a Vietnam vet, talk with them, see what their opinions are, try and get a sense of what it was that they were doing and why they felt like they needed to do it or why they did it at all. Because oftentimes many of those who went did so because they were forced, not because they chose to. And that, of course, raises some important questions about whether or not a country that was founded voluntarily based upon self-government should then force folks to go to fight. But that's a discussion for another day. I'm already over my time by a few minutes here, so I'm going to leave it at that. But let me know your thoughts. If you have questions or concerns, what have you, contact me. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.